This is a case file. This one is not about what you do for other people. It is about the person doing it and how long it has been since anyone, including you, has actually seen them. Every forensic examination begins with a body and a question. This one begins with a question you have probably asked yourself at 2 a.m. for no reason you could name. If no one needed anything from me right now, who exactly would I be? You have called it being easygoing. You have called it just knowing how to read a room. You have called it not wanting to be difficult. None of those words are lies exactly. They are just the explanation available to someone who has never been shown what that skill actually cost to build, or how early the construction started. 6 findings, 1 final report, and a pediatrician who spent his career listening to infants who could not yet speak until he could hear in their silence exactly the moment a person starts disappearing from their own life. Donald Winnicott was a British pediatrician and psychoanalyst who treated thousands of children and their mothers across 4 decades, and who broadcast radio talks during the Second World War, reassuring exhausted parents that ordinary, imperfect care was enough. He was not interested in cataloging cruelty. He was interested in something quieter and far more common. The ordinary, well-meaning failures of attunement that teach a child, long before language, that their actual self is not the one that gets to stay in the room. During the war, he worked directly with children evacuated from London, separated from their parents, placed with strangers, and showing in his clinical notes exactly the kind of compliant, eerily undemanding behavior the adults around them mistook for resilience. Winnicott did not mistake it. He recognized a child working very hard to be no trouble at all, and he spent the rest of his career tracing what that particular kind of hard work does to a person who keeps doing it long after the war and the strangers are gone. Begin. Before we examine what happened to you, we have to establish what Winnicott actually found, because the popular version of people-pleasing leaves out the part that matters most. Winnicott described an infant as arriving with spontaneous gestures, a reach, a cry, a particular way of needing something, each one an unrehearsed expression of a self that does not yet know it is being watched. A caregiver who is, in his words, good enough, not perfect, just adequately responsive, meets enough of those gestures with recognition that the infant starts to trust its own impulses are real and survivable to express. But when a caregiver consistently cannot tolerate, reflect, or respond to those spontaneous gestures, through their own exhaustion, fear, or unmet needs, rarely through cruelty, the infant adapts. It learns to offer a self the caregiver can actually receive, and to withhold the one that keeps going unanswered. This is the first finding. What looks from the outside like a personality, agreeable, attuned, easy to be around, was frequently a survival strategy assembled before you had any other tools to keep a relationship alive. Winnicott called it the false self, and he was explicit that building one was not weakness. It was the only intelligent option available to a person with no power and no exit. Notice what this finding does not say. It does not say you are fake.
It does not say the warmth, the attentiveness, the instinct for what a room needs is an act with no one behind it. It says the opposite, that there was someone behind it the entire time, working extremely hard under conditions nobody examining this case file ever consented to. Of all the spontaneous gestures a false self learns to suppress, one gets buried deepest because it was usually the one a caregiver could least afford to receive: protest, anger. The simple, healthy no of a person whose boundary has actually been crossed. This is why so many people who fit this profile cannot locate their own anger in the room where it happens. It arrives late, in the car afterward, in the shower, at 3 a.m, addressed to a person who is no longer present to hear it. Winnicott went further than naming the strategy. He described in one of his clearest sentences exactly what the strategy is for. "It is joy to be hidden," he wrote, "but disaster not to be found." Sit with the second half of that sentence, because it is the one almost everyone skips past. The false self is not simply a mask. It is a hiding place, and Winnicott considered its work a genuine success only if the true self stayed safely concealed inside it. But a self that is never found by anyone is also a self that is never actually known, never actually loved for what it specifically is, only for the performance standing in front of it, taking the compliments on its behalf. This is why a particular kind of praise never quite lands. "You're so easy to be around. I never have to worry about you." Each one is accurate, and each one is aimed entirely at the structure doing the hiding, which is exactly why receiving it can feel less like being seen and more like watching someone compliment your coat. This is the second finding. The exact mechanism that kept you safe is the same mechanism that now keeps you lonely in rooms full of people who like you. Hiding worked. That was always the design. Nobody designed an exit. Here is where the case file moves from your childhood into your Tuesday afternoon, because Winnicott's mechanism did not stay contained in the nursery. A false self that succeeded once does not retire. It generalizes. It starts scanning every room you enter for the same signal it was originally built to detect. What does this person need from me in order to stay safe and connected to them? And it answers before you consciously decide anything. By the time you notice you are doing it, the agreeable response is already halfway out of your mouth, assembled by a process that started running decades before you had any say in its instructions. Exhibit 1. The meeting where you agreed to take on the extra work before you had even finished calculating whether you had the time for it. Exhibit 2. The friendship where you have apologized for things that were never actually your fault, simply because a silence had opened up, and silence to this system reads as danger requiring an immediate repair. Exhibit 3. The family dinner where you can predict with total accuracy what every other person at the table needs from you in order to stay comfortable, and no real idea what you would order if you were eating alone. Exhibit 4. The relationship where "I'm fine" left your mouth before you had even finished checking whether it was true, because checking first was never part of how this particular reflex got built. This is the third finding.
The exhaustion you have called burnout or just being tired lately is frequently the cost of running two systems at once. One producing the self the room appears to require, and a second one, further back, still quietly keeping score of everything it was never permitted to say. Listen for the vocabulary this system defaults to under pressure. Whatever works for you. I don't mind, honestly. Don't worry about me. Each phrase sounds like generosity.
Functionally, each one is a small, automatic transfer of the decision away from a person whose own preference was never going to be asked for in the first place. Winnicott had a name for the place where a different outcome was supposed to develop, and its absence explains a complaint you may not have realized was related to any of this. He called it potential space, the area between an infant and the world, neither fully self nor fully other, where play happens, where a child first experiments with being a self with no audience to perform for. In that space, according to Winnicott, a person learns to want things simply because they want them, with no one's approval required as a precondition. It is the original training ground for having an inner life that belongs to no one but you. When a caregiver's failures of attunement are severe or constant enough, that space narrows, sometimes nearly to nothing. Compliance moves in and occupies the territory creativity was supposed to use. Winnicott is also the reason an entire generation of parents stopped worrying about a child's attachment to one specific blanket or stuffed animal. He called it a transitional object, a thing the child controls completely, that asks nothing of anyone, and that exists solely inside the same potential space this finding is about. Most people outgrow the blanket. What Winnicott's theory suggests is that they were never meant to outgrow the space behind it, the simple private experience of choosing something for no reason except that it was theirs. This is the fourth finding. If you have ever felt a low-grade panic at unstructured time, a Sunday with nothing required of you, a hobby with no audience and no metric, you were not lazy and you were not broken. You were standing in a potential space that never got the chance to be furnished, looking for instructions that were never going to arrive because the entire point of that space was that none should. It is also why so many people who fit this profile describe a strange blankness when finally asked, with no agenda attached, what they actually want. Not a refusal to answer. An honest search through a room that was never given anything to put on the shelves. There is a final, quieter cost the case file would be incomplete without. What happens when the false self does not just survive, but excels? Winnicott observed that in some people, the compliant self becomes so capable, so socially fluent, that it gets mistaken by everyone, including the person living inside it, for the entire personality. No crisis ever forces a closer look. These are frequently the most competent people in any room. They are also, by Winnicott's own account, at the greatest risk of a specific and disorienting symptom, a persistent, private sense of being a fraud, of performing a self so well that even they have lost the thread of where the performance ends. They are also, more often than not, the ones everyone else quietly assigns to be the strong one, the reliable one, the one who has it together, a reputation that forecloses almost completely anyone ever checking in to ask whether it is still true. That feeling is not evidence that you are secretly deficient. By this case file's own logic, it is closer to the opposite. Proof that a true self is still in there, filing its objection, refusing to be fully erased by even the most successful impersonation built to replace it. This is the fifth finding. Imposter syndrome, examined under this file, is frequently not a skills problem at all. It is the true self's signature, the one part of the original mechanism Winnicott's theory predicts should survive, because it was never destroyed. It was only ever hidden, on purpose, by a system built to keep it that way. This is the final finding. It would be satisfying to end this case file by declaring the false self a mistake to be torn out and discarded. Winnicott's own clinical work argues almost the opposite. He did not treat the false self as the enemy. He treated it as a structure that had done its job, sometimes for decades, and that could finally be permitted to stand down, not through force, but through exactly the kind of attention it was built in the absence of. In his clinical accounts, that attention rarely arrived as a single dramatic breakthrough. It arrived in small, repeated moments where a person's unrehearsed gesture, an unplanned opinion, an unpolished reaction, a want with no justification attached, was met with simple, steady tolerance instead of the silence it was trained to expect. Winnicott's clinical term for this was a holding environment, and his findings suggest one can be built decades after childhood in a good marriage, a good friendship, a good course of therapy, anywhere a person is met often enough and calmly enough for hiding to finally stop feeling like the only safe option on the table. It rarely announces itself. It looks like saying the unimpressive true answer instead of the easy one once to someone who does not flinch. It looks like leaving a Sunday empty on purpose and sitting with the blankness instead of immediately filling it with something useful. It looks like noticing the specific compliment that never lands and asking for the first time what it would take to be complimented on something else. Winnicott's clinical notes describe this kind of turning point again and again, and it is rarely dramatic. A patient says something flatly negative about someone they are supposed to love, and nothing happens. No withdrawal, no repair required. The sentence is simply allowed to stand. That is the entire mechanism, scaled down to its smallest unit, an unauthorized, true sentence, spoken out loud, met with nothing worse than ordinary attention. You were never asked whether you wanted to build a false self. You were a child with no other tools, doing the only intelligent thing available to you. That part of the file is closed, and nothing in it was your failure. What stays open is the question Winnicott spent his career insisting was not rhetorical. Whether the self that went into hiding all those years ago is still findable. His own data, decades of children and adults who were eventually found, says it usually still is. That is the autopsy report. Case closed.